Hello and welcome to today's WorkSafe Month webinar, Psychological Injury Towards Safe and Durable Return to Work. I'm Stephanie Morawski from WorkSafe Tasmania and I will be your moderator. Please take a moment to read the following slide about information received today. I will now go over housekeeping. Here is a screenshot of the attendee control panel. You should see something that looks like this on the right hand of your screen. You're likely listening in using your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to listen over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. Webcams and audience microphones will not be used in today's webinar. Questions will be taken at the end of the presentation. Please use your questions pane on your control panel to type and submit your questions. Finally, today's webinar is being recorded. I would now like to introduce your presenters, Anne-Marie Dean and Ruth Feeger, workplace rehabilitation providers and members of the Tasmanian Association of Vocational Rehabilitation Providers. Anne-Marie is a rehabilitation counsellor with 25 years experience working with psychological injury. Ruth is an occupational therapist with 31 years experience in vocational rehabilitation in Tasmanian and Commonwealth jurisdictions, working with physical and psychological injury. Both Anne-Marie and Ruth are accredited workplace rehabilitation providers in the Tasmanian jurisdiction. They are full members of the Tasmanian Association of Vocational Rehabilitation Providers, the peak body representing workplace rehabilitation providers in Tasmania. Welcome, Anne-Marie and Ruth.
Thank you, Stephanie. So this is Anne-Marie Dean. I'm starting off and then I'll hand over to my colleague Ruth later and throughout the session. So today we'd like to talk about psychological injury and covering some information around the challenges that might be faced, some potential strategies that could be used to overcome the challenges, managing workplace psychological injury, and we're also going to use some case studies to illustrate the points that we cover. Psychological injury includes a range of cognitive, emotional, and behavioural symptoms that interfere with the worker's life and can significantly affect how they think, feel, behave, and interact with others. Psychological injury may include such disorders as depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress disorder. While job stress is a term that we often hear and is commonly used to describe physical and emotional symptoms which arise in response to work situations, in itself it is not a disorder or a psychological injury. Work-related mental health conditions, also known as psychological injuries, have become a major concern in Australian workplaces due to the negative impact on individual employees and the costs associated with the long periods away from work that are typical of these claims. Safe Work Australia outlines that in the year 2017-18, 7,685 Australians were compensated for work-related mental health conditions, equating to around 7% of all workers' compensation claims, making up 8.2% of claims in Tasmania. These claims had the highest amount of lost time, an average of 16 weeks per claim compared to 6 weeks for all claims, and the highest amount of compensation paid, an average of $32,000 compared to $9,000 for all claims. As I mentioned, claims involving mental health conditions are usually associated with an above average time off work and higher than average claim costs. These claims cover high lost work time rates across a wide range of industries. The consequences can be catastrophic and can result in the loss of function and in distress, not only for the injured worker, but also can negatively impact the worker's family, their colleagues, managers, and the organisation as a whole. Early intervention and referral is key, as the long-term involvement in the system can lead to poor outcomes. If we look at this pictorial, some information contained outlines that work-related stress can be described when the demands of a job exceed the individual's ability or perceived ability to cope. Psychological hazards in workplaces can be as numerous and as dangerous as physical hazards on an employee's health and safety. And in the bottom left-hand corner, prolonged exposure to these hazards can lead to workplace injuries. If we look at the process for psychological injuries and physical injuries in returning to work, for physical injuries, often the incident is reported within approximately 24 hours, and the worker receives appropriate treatment, returning to work soon after, depending on the severity of the injuries and the treatment required. However, for psychological injuries, workers may initially choose to seek support and treatment outside the workers' compensation system, perhaps taking long periods of time or lots of incidental leave, sick leave, annual leave, time with leave without pay, for example, when they've exhausted all of their leave entitlements. It can be several weeks before the worker may decide to lodge a claim for compensation, which can lead to an investigation of the circumstances of the injury within the workplace. This can be an adversarial process or perceived in that way, and the worker can feel in limbo during that time. The two possible outcomes of the investigation are that the claim is accepted, with a diagnosis and treatment being provided before commencing a graduated return to work when medically able to do so, or the claim is not accepted. However, this does not mean that the injured worker is suddenly well again and able to resume work. In this situation, workers' compensation insurers can provide resources throughout the process while determining liability, though there can be limited support structures within organisations, along with individual stigma of having their claim denied, which can result in the employee experiencing significant difficulties in their return to work. Workplace health and safety and workers' compensation laws in Australia outline the requirement of employers to provide a physically and psychologically safe workplace for their employees. Safe Work Australia has developed a paper titled Work-Related Psychological Health and Safety, a Systematic Approach to Meeting Your Duties. There's a link to that at the end of this slide presentation. The information in this paper can help employers meet their legal requirements to eliminate or minimize the risk of psychological injuries in the workplace, and also over time improve the organization's approach to preventing psychological injury and supporting recovery. If we look at when a psychological injury is compensable, workers' compensation laws state that the employment and factors associated with it must have been a significant contributing factor to the injury. And psychological injury claims are typically not accepted if they are a result of reasonable administrative action. There is no recipe or quick fix for psychological injuries. Each case needs careful assessment and targeted, evidence-based collaborative management to achieve the best possible outcome. A comprehensive approach involving all stakeholders and incorporating the biopsychosocial flags model, as on this slide, with consideration of each of the various flags and proactively working to overcome them, is required to have the best chance of achieving a safe and durable return to work. As with all workplace injuries, understanding that the individual is more than their injury or diagnosis and their job title, and that holistically they have other roles and impacting factors on their recovery, can also result in a more successful and sustainable return to work outcome. We also might look at these flags as protective factors, in that if the employee not only has an absence of these flags, but also a number of positives associated with each of the biopsychosocial factors listed. For example, robust levels of resilience, flexible attitudes towards the use of their coping strategies, as well as having access to a number of coping strategies, good social support networks, enjoyment of their job, and a sense of being valued within the organisation. Intervention in the early stage of a psychological claim, such as providing appropriate support and identifying and addressing workplace issues that may be causing or contributing to the psychological distress, can often prevent a situation deteriorating and a worker developing a psychological injury. The Safe Work Australia website has a fact sheet, as listed at the bottom of this slide, that you might find useful for more information. Now, to get over the technical mumbo jumbo, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Ruth, who'll carry on from here.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. What do WRPs do, or workplace rehab providers do, and what value can they add? So workplace rehab providers are tertiary trained 4-year graduates as occupational therapists, psychologists, rehab counsellors, physios and exercise physiologists, and the latter in physical injuries, more specifically, of course. OTs work across with both physical and psych, but they have that baseline qualification before they then specialise in the area of vocational rehabilitation. With regard to psychological injury, the predominant WRP background is of psychology or occupational therapy, because they have the professional background to understand what the injured worker diagnosis is, that they have the capacity to identify the functional implications of the injury, to look at what the effective treatment approaches and the capacity to thoroughly assess the individual worker's needs. Also to conduct thorough workplace task analysis of psychological hazards, the risks, and also the components of the job. And using then this as they also have the capacity to engage with the worker, the treaters, primarily the GPs and other parties like psychologists and psychiatrists or whoever else may be involved in supporting the recovery for this injured worker. Strong professional liaison with all parties is absolutely critical to the good skill set of a WRP. One of the unique features of the way in which WRP works is a community-based model. So they're often involved in, for example, the 3 stages of conducting a thorough initial assessment of an injured worker. Often, for example, they may well meet a person in their home environment. Not always. It depends on where a person may feel safe. They may feel safe in a particular area of the work, or in a neutral territory. But more than often, it is in the home environment. And this often, particularly, can give a bit more insight as well to some of the coping strategies that might be evident or not evident in that environment with that injured worker. For example, if the worker is saying that their normal job and their normal family responsibility is to keep the home clean and whatever, and things look fairly chaotic and untended, that's a good reflection of how they may or may not be coping at that point in time with their injury. So there's a meeting of the injured worker and then meeting in the workplace. So there's visiting physically, engaging with the workplace and liaising with whoever's the relevant supervisors in the organisation, and conducting a task analysis, as well as looking at any risk triggers and a psychological analysis of it. So looking at the work culture, the relationships that exist in the work, as well as the work itself, etc. And the third part of this community model is to meet with the worker in person with their treating doctor, GP primarily. And it's a really effective process to share the assessment that's been conducted by the WRP, and to identify areas for risk management, and to discuss with the doctor and the worker together in the same time about what the doctor's plans are for treatments, and what timeframes may be required for recovery, and what options may exist in the workplace for a strategic and effective return to work. So just drilling down a little bit further, the 3 elements of the WRP's job is to assess the injured worker thoroughly first. So that can include a whole range of, it's a very customised approach really, because everyone presents in a different way. But essentially what they should be doing is looking at what are the triggers, what are the sort of the antecedents to causing these problems that people are experiencing, what their current symptoms are, and more particularly, so symptoms could include tearfulness, worrying all the time, ruminative thoughts, or chewing the cud over the same theme of thought, breakthrough thoughts, mental fatigue, social withdrawal, poor sleep, or difficulty getting to sleep, or waking multiple times, irritability, low mood, pessimism, distrust, hypervigilance towards perceived pressure. That's often a feature, particularly with people who are anxious, a need to control, a difficulty with decision making, with poor concentration or focus, memory impairment, and there's a broader range, but that's an example. So looking at what those symptoms are and what the current treatment plan is that they're undergoing, what medications and other psychological treatments that they may be having, and how that's impacting on their recovery. And more particularly, looking at how their symptoms and treatment are impacting on their domains of activities of daily living. So looking at how an individual's managing with their self-care, with domestic care, with family responsibilities, with community engagement, with their hobby, whether they've got enough ability to, well enough to engage with hobbies and interests. That's often one that's really at the bottom of the pile. With their sleep, with social engagement, that's often an area where people not well enough and disengage from. And all of those elements, looking at their activities of daily living, so that having a good understanding of where they're at then helps provider work with the injured worker to set some goals in their recovery. Also identify perceptions and beliefs about work, about what their work involves, rosters and timetables or whatever the case may be, the elements of the work, and what the recovery steps may look like, and what expectations there can be around returning to work, and also about imagining a return to work. How do you see it working? What can you imagine? Again, you'd ask that question very much depending on how a person's presenting. Then going on to looking at the work, do a really thorough analysis of what does work involve. So looking at the duties through the lens of the medical condition that the injured worker has. So look at what issues may have triggered the injury, look at leadership, reporting lines, workflow, what hazards may be where there's this high or low job demands, poor support, poor workplace relationships, poor clarity of role, change management that hasn't gone so well, organisational justice that hasn't gone so well perhaps, or remote or isolated work, or environmental conditions, or violent or traumatic events, and looking at the break schedules and the opportunity for variety, etc., etc. So there's a whole range of things. And the other important thing is what concerns may the worker and the employer have regarding returning to work, and what are the needs to manage a successful work? What's the milieu, what's the social and cultural norm of that workplace, and what sort of flexibility exists? The other thing is with the workplace is identifying if there may be suitable duties, if the WRP is thinking that that may be required, and sometimes that can be a really good inroad into re-establishing someone back to work, for example. And the important thing at that phase is to start some really clear goal setting, small, achievable, using the SMART models. So specific, measurable, achievable, realistic and time-framed, but a couple of short goals and small goals to then start to work towards recovery, and talking very much about normalising everyday activities to try and build that recovery trajectory. And the third element is assessing, working with the treater, the general practitioner, and often with the psychologist by telephone usually. But attending at the right timing is attending with the injured worker and meeting with the GP, confirming the diagnosis and prognosis and the timeframes and any further treatments that might be considered. And the workplace rehab provider should then be sharing the information about the functional assessment they've done, the workplace assessment, sort of areas for improvement or areas where they think that there might be some latitude to work with to support a return to work, and share some options about return to work planning when it's timely. Sometimes the first meeting is not a timely, a decision can't be made and shouldn't be made, and you understand that, but it's important to put on the table what the world of possibility may look like. And then in that meeting, agree on a short-term pathway for recovery and next steps, and then follow up with agreed intervals with the treaters and the worker. So there's those three elements that are constantly moving with a WRP in the way that they're working with all the different parties. Just moving along, so the challenges for faced with psychological injuries. Apart from the obvious with effective treatment and, that medication's working well, psychological treatment's working well and so forth, the really critical challenge that is so important is that there's in the absence, sometimes when people go off work, particularly if there's a conflictual element to it, there's been some breakdown in relationship or belief about what's going on in the workplace, and it's not uncommon that workplaces don't actually keep contact with the worker, and they've already become unwell, they're off work, and in the absence of good communication lines open between the worker and the workplace, it can often then lead very quickly for a person to become more isolated and socially isolated, and that kind of can set the cat amongst the pigeons, so to speak, with people feeling less cared for. And of course, the other thing that happens again, if people are unwell because of conflict, there often people are unwell because there could be an assault or other situations, but I'm particularly honing in on that to illustrate this example, is that where there is a lack of good quality communication and care being shared between the workplace and the worker, if someone's in a conflicted mindset, as human beings, always we are, attentionally biased to whatever evidence we gather around us that proves our particular point. So the absence of any contact from the workplace can easily lead to a thought process with an injured worker who's already feeling poorly and isolated, to feel, look, nobody cares, nobody's interested, nobody wants me back. So it's really important to maintain good communication. Sometimes indeed a worker is not well enough, and that needs to be respected, but even there a leader should take their leadership responsibilities well and say, look, I'll just text you and check in with you every couple of weeks if that's okay. I need to know, is there anything you need from me? How can I help you? Those sorts of things. And the other thing is, of course, if there's any social things going on, Molly's retiring after 72 years in the job, make sure that that person's invited to whatever's going on. They may choose not to engage, but it's important that they are invited because they remain the fabric of that workplace. Other challenges are the stigma of health issues. Now, with some people become really unwell very quickly in a work context. Some of it's a slow burn, and some it's very quick. And for some people, it actually catches them by the surprise. And sometimes injured workers will say that they feel, that everyone's judging them around, being unwell, or they feel like they're a failure. And it's really important to give some good, strong psychoeducation in that space and help them understand it's their illness talking, it's not them as a person. These are the signs of symptoms of your illness. And the other thing is about some employers don't say anything because they're fearful of what to say. They're scared of aggravating a situation or whatever case may be. Again, if you've got an attitude of, open-hearted kindness and willingness to show compassion and engage with your worker, that usually is well received, and it's an important thing to do. And so there's not much you can say wrong, but when an employer says something like, how are you going? We are actually really missing you. Are there any things that you need from us at the moment? How are the kids going? Whatever it is, but those sorts of pastoral care type conversations in the early days. The other one barrier can be when someone who's really becomes very unwell, they need hospitalisation or they're just not able to engage. And that's where a WRP needs to keep in touch as well with the worker in a reasonable and agreed way to understand how to best support them in that space. Sometimes there's challenges with suitable duties within a workplace, not always, but there's more and more people are much more flexible with their thinking, but it's not always the case, and I do appreciate that. So there can be some difficulties with that, and that can be a challenge with trying to find suitable duties if a person, for example, can't go back to their pre-injury jobs in the first instance or at all. Sometimes there's situations where there's comorbidities with the injured worker and the family, where there might be there's a work-related injury and it may well be an accepted claim, or it's still pending, but it's unfolding. But there could be a lot of other white noise happening in that injured worker's life as well, which is adding to the burden. So you may have a very ill child, or there could be conflict in a marriage, or there could be other things that are running along concurrently that are actually adding more difficulty for that person, where they don't have necessarily, good support in the family. Sometimes I've come across workers who've actually not told their families that they're unwell or injured, and that's, a problem in itself. The other thing that can be a challenge for managing workplace psych injuries is if someone's been off work for a little while in their recovery and they start to make downward lifestyle changes. For example, you've got someone off and they usually got their children in childcare, but they cancel childcare and look after Johnny at home, and so forth and so on. It's really important that WRP is alert and aware of all of those things, so you can counsel someone around, look, don't relinquish your normal structures you've got in your family life, because when it comes to time to come back to work, you can't have that as a barrier to returning to work. That will actually create another stress and tension for you. So those sorts of changes can really become an impediment for people. And the other thing that can really get in the way with recovery is where people focus on the claim rather than on recovery, and that can be a really fraught and distressing process, particularly, you know, where there's conflict sort of scenarios that are unfolding. That's just some of the challenges. I'm sure there's many more, and I'll think of them when I've finished, but that's enough for now. Some of the strategies in terms of working with injured workers with psychological injuries. So coming back to my beginning point, the thorough needs assessment is absolutely quintessential. So you need to really take the time to unpack what the circumstances of the person is, how they are managing, what the work involves, what are the options and flexibilities there in the work, and also what the treatment plan is with the medication and or psychological, and what's the viewpoint of the treaters in that space. So gathering all the threads together into a meaningful whole, and at every step of the way communicating strongly and effectively with the injured worker, engaging them and including them in every step of the way as well. This is about them, for them and with them, and that's really primary behaviour that the WRP needs to engage with. Sometimes people can be who've got some anxiety or depression, or got some concerns around work. Sometimes they are quite avoidant, and avoidance can have its usefulness in an early phase to minimise stress, but prolonged avoidance of things can become problematic in itself. It can become another barrier to return to work, and in fact it can amplify anxiety. So if a person's left work in a circumstance that wasn't so good, they weren't very, they sort of broke down at work, or there was some sort of conflict or whatever, sometimes that's their last remnant memory, and so it's important to reinstall new fresh memories. So having a systematic desensitization plan is a really good way of doing that, and some of it can be many and varied, but some way could be, for example, organising, if you can find a good relationship with the workplace, organise a meeting in a neutral area if that's going to be more constructive with the injured worker and the workplace or the supervisor. And it's a very light touch sort of meeting, nothing too deep, nothing conflictual, nothing too big to get around, but just an opportunity to meet face to face, to share about how things are, perhaps whatever level people want to disclose, and just very light touch, but it's a way to re-engage. And again, when people are away, it's easy to sort of build a bigger and bigger image of what may have gone on or may be happening than it really may be. And so that's a good way to sort of bridge that gap. And people can feel really triumphant sometimes when they've done that. They think, oh, that's not so bad after all, that's really good. The next one may be to meet together in the workplace. Depends, again, it's very variable. You have to customise your approach, but is to talk about the return of work needs. So the worker and the workplace and yourself are brokering a conversation about what those needs may be. You've got guidelines already from the treaters about what they are. And so you're just unpacking that and fleshing it out a little bit. And then there may be a third meeting before a return to work, where you just go through more materially through the details of the plan that may well be written up, and just walk through that and just rehearse any areas together and sign off on it. So there's a few points of contact along the way that prepares the person. Another element of strategies is to have a continual goal-setting program for normalising activities of daily living, because they're really good indicators of a person's well-being. If a person's starting to re-engage with social activities, or they're sleeping better, or they're able to get better concentration, so they're able to read a short book that's of lightweight value for them, or whatever the case may be, but continuing to normalise activities of daily living is a really important thing. Educating people around the sort of some of the features that commonly present themselves when you're returning someone to work, and you need to be alert and aware and educate the workplace and the worker about this. And also it helps to identify with identifying suitable duties. The WRP should look at the least difficult tasks to the more complex tasks, the more time pressured tasks or higher cognitive decision making tasks, or whatever the case may be. The lower level tasks are ones where they're more automatic responses, old learned memory, nothing too novel, not too time pressured, fairly automatic type tasks. They're the sort of the low hanging fruit that you'd be looking at, possibly, not all times, but it could be one way to sort of start segueing back into work. So looking at memory, talking about memory and concentration, focus, talking about mental energy, feeling fatigued when you do a little bit of focused conversation, and how normal that is when you're recovering. Again, with decision making, about perceiving pressure. Often people who are anxious often perceive pressure a lot more. They're more sensitized to it than the average Yogi Bear. So looking at, time accuracy and all those sorts of things, or the accuracy of the tasks, things that you talk about when you're planning a return to work. So I said we start with quick wins and low hanging fruit tasks, and then to start to establish some competence and confidence, and then you can build as their job, their job capacities improve. And that's a really important element. Sometimes, so I've lost, okay, another one is sometimes where conflict is a feature that's precipitated the injury, and there is a need for some healing of relationships or healing of the way there's engagement in the workplace. Sometimes there's a need for some conflict coaching, and by that I mean one-on-one with the injured worker, and that helps them understand and get some perspective on the issues that have arisen and their reactions and responses to that, and just helps them process it in a different light. It's not a therapeutic, it's not a treatment like a psychology treatment, it's a coaching technique that can actually really help to take down the tone of the experience for the person. It can also be a good precursor to prepare them if mediation may be useful. And again, mediation can be very valuable. Sometimes it's necessary first before someone comes back into a work environment. Other times it can be applied when someone comes back into the work environment for a few weeks, and then that and gets a little bit more sort of traction on their return to work and feels a little bit more confident and stable. And then you might introduce some mediation with whoever is doing that. Absolutely critical to ensure using a really competent a mediator who's independent and very skilled, and what goes on in Vegas stays in Vegas. So in other words, that it remains very confidential, and there's follow through to check that has been actually implemented, the agreed outcomes have been implemented. It can be quite provocative, mediation, and so that's why it seems to have been working more recently in some of the work that I've been doing is not bringing it in immediately, but bringing it in a second stage, and it seems to have been more effective in that way. But again, it's really important to do a thorough assessment and really customise what you're doing and how you're working with your people at any point in time, and be flexible and creative, and listen to the needs of your worker and your workplace and what your treaters are telling you, and take that on all on board and make it into a meaningful whole. So with doing all that, with doing the assessment, with looking at attitudes, possibilities, looking at expectations regarding return to work and all those sorts of things, I've just remembered some other things that I wanted to say. In developing the return to work plan, some of the short-term strategies that can be really useful are things like working into the plan and coaching in that plan. Is often people are really worried about, what am I going to say? What if someone asks me, why I've been off work? I haven't told anyone about this. It's very common. And sometimes by coaching them to have what I call a cocktail line, and that is that, just have a response. They say, oh, Ruth, where you been? We've really missed you. So you just give a closed answer that sounds like your words that you feel comfortable with. Oh, I've been on leave and I'm back now and I'm really pleased to be back. Boom. Shut down any conversation. Sometimes there's a conversation before coming back to work about, with permission with the worker, maybe the team leader might send an email, say, Ruth's back at work on Monday for a couple of hours. It'd be great to let her welcome her back and just let her get on with things or whatever. Sometimes you do that if you think that person's at risk of being swamped by love in the workplace and get distressed because they can't apply themselves and can't get down to work because every man and his dog's coming out to see them. Another one is develop a take 5 strategy. So if a person's overwhelmed, they've got some tools to use. So if they're say if they're working in an environment, a desk environment, where they may feel a little overwhelmed and emotional, apart from obviously using breathing and other CBT techniques they may use with their psychologists, using a pre-arrangement with their supervisor. They might flick an email or a text to say, I'm taking 5. They can just go to the loo and do some deep breathing or go for a quick walk around the block, come back and then just let the team leader know they're back, especially if the team leader's not in line of sight of that person, so they know that they're safe. But they don't need to seek permission, but they've got some control. And again, if people feel they've got an out, that's a really important mechanism. Having low expectations for the return to work is always a good one. Not building it up, keeping it really simple, and also keeping life simple, not planning big events around a return to work. And having regular reviews, obviously, with the worker and the workplace, and have the worker and the workplace and worker having regular reviews together and checking in. Sometimes it may be a worker saying hi and bye each day with that person, so that there's some sort of build up of communication capital going on, and someone's aware of that worker's needs and the worker knows that they can go to them. Having a formal review process as well as an informal one works often very well. And the other thing is to give people time to settle into the return to work. So sometimes with people who are anxious, it's better it can be better, and again, it's very individual, but it can be better if you've got 2 half days that they're starting, rather than have Monday, Wednesday, Friday, which may be a fairly traditional way that you might start with a physical injury. With a psychological injury, sometimes working 2 short days together, like a Monday, Tuesday, 4 hours apiece, and then a break, and then Thursday, works quite well, because often people have got an anxiety and they've got a whole lot of anticipatory anxiety about coming back to work. They've done their work and then they go home from work, they're tired, have a recovery, and then they spend the next day, if they're off, worrying about going back to work. So sometimes it's good to just shorten that worrying time, and that can be helpful. The other thing is, if people have been out of circulation for a while, maybe they need some refreshment, or they just need to re-lubricate their brain about some of the tasks they're doing. And it allows 2 consecutive short days, allows that little bit more embedding of new or old memories, and just allows them to get into a rhythm. But one of the other strategies is not making any judgments about the effectiveness of the return to work too early. It's really important to give people some time to settle in, and the WRP should, often let them know, all the best for your for that week. Be very mindful of them and check in with them towards the latter part of that week, not check in too early. Give people time and dignity to sort of go through their early phases and let them process how they've managed that and settle into it. And also, coaching people to know that they might be more emotional and they might be worrying the night before. That's very normal, and it's okay. You'll move through that. So that's a fairly quick Cook's tour of some of the strategies that can be used. And in doing those pieces of work and constantly in quality communication with all the parties, that's the way the WRP can actually help drive and support a really orderly and harmonious and peaceful return to work process. Now I'm going to move back to Anne-Marie, and she's going to present a case study to share.
Thanks very much, Ruth. So just a note before we start on the case studies, just wanted to make sure that everybody's aware that the names and situations in our case studies have been changed for confidentiality purposes. The case study that I'd like to talk about today is that of an injured worker who was involved in a workplace assault by a member of the public involving a weapon. Sandra's colleague was also involved, we'll call the worker Sandra. Her colleague was also involved in the assault. As the rehabilitation provider, I was referred both individuals to support through their return to work. Both individuals were exposed to the same situation, however, their outcomes were somewhat different. During the initial assessment, Sandra reported that she had been involved in a similar assault 5 years ago. The first workers' compensation claim had been handled well, she had received appropriate psychological treatment for PTSD and, with the support of her employer and her rehab provider, had returned to work. She acknowledged that while it had not been easy, she enjoyed her job, loved the team she worked with, and after approximately 12 months of a graduated return to work, lots of bumps in the roads, and hard work on her part, she had recovered. Sandra at this time was distressed that the second incident had occurred. She felt responsible and that she should have been able to prevent this second incident. She also felt guilty for her colleague being exposed to the second traumatic event and that she was unable to protect her colleague. Sandra disclosed in the initial assessment that she had a husband and 2 children. She reported having a good social support network, and after the first incident and recovery from that, had maintained good mental health and well-being, including eating well, exercising as much as possible, and keeping her social connections. In talking with Sandra and working with her doctor and psychologist, Sandra advised that she did not want the label of PTSD, rather that she preferred a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress. Sandra stated that she found the label created expectations and stigma of herself and by others. Sandra's employer also reported a sense of guilt that this had happened to Sandra a second time. He stated that after the first incident 5 years ago, they had reviewed and updated their security and safety procedures and protocols and were of the belief that these were appropriate for their workplace. Over a period of 6 months, the collaborative approach taken by all stakeholders involved in Sandra's injury recovery and return to function and to work included the incorporation of SMART goals that Ruth has referred to previously, being specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time measured. Realistic expectations of her recovery, her return to work, and of the workers' compensation process were openly discussed with all parties so that everybody knew their role in the process of supporting her return to work. Sandra was encouraged to celebrate the little wins, starting with things like a small walk around the block twice a week, through to returning to the workplace for a colleague's birthday morning tea. Then commencing work duties initially at home and on reduced hours and days, with the full support and encouragement from her manager, through to ultimately working her pre-injury hours and duties in the workplace. At the cessation of my involvement in her return to work program, Sandra acknowledged that while she initially thought this second workplace incident would mark the end of her career, she was able to work hard to overcome the psychological distress she experienced, was able to utilize the strategies learned in her previous recovery, with some support and reminders from her psychologist, to lean on others for support, and have trust that her employer wanted the best outcome for her and the organisation. She was understanding of the return to work process and saw benefit in everyone working together to support her, even on the days that she didn't particularly want to get out of bed. The employer and his team were open to taking on suggestions for additional safety measures, even if seen as over the top by some employees, and they were flexible in accommodating Sandra in a number of roles and locations within the organisation, including initially always working with a colleague, never alone, and working in a back office role in order to feel confident and safe within the workplace. While it was not without its setbacks, Sandra's return to work succeeded as a result of the collaborative approach taken by everyone involved in her life, from her family and friends, as well as those with roles within the workers' compensation process. Interestingly, Sandra's decision not to focus on PTSD and rather that she was experiencing post-traumatic stress is believed to be one of the main strengths in her recovery. She was able to focus on her return to work rather than getting caught up in the diagnosis and what that meant. She even stated, while she would never want to go through the experience again or wish it upon anybody else, she believed she experienced a level of what's called post-traumatic growth and was able to build upon her levels of resilience as a result. As a side note, at the time of me closing Sandra's rehabilitation and return to work file, her colleague, who had also been involved in the same incident and was provided with the same level of support from the workplace, from myself as her rehab provider and medically, remained unfit, was struggling with daily activities and was unsure when she would be able to return to work, although she was hopeful that she would be able to return to work in some capacity in the near future. She was very envious of Sandra's progress and her resilience, and noted that she had a number of confounding factors within her life that were impacting on her recovery. This suggests that no injury, workplace, or group of circumstances is the same, and an individualized process of understanding and support must be provided. Ultimately, with the support of return to work process, this individual did return to work within about 6 months of the time. Also, if you have an interest in my reference to Sandra's talk about using post-traumatic stress as compared to post-traumatic stress disorder and the diagnostic labels and resulting stigma that can be attached, you might be interested in the webinar in a couple of weeks entitled "You've Only Sprained Your Brain" by Rob Urbach. He will talk more about the impact of language used with psychological injuries. So now I'll hand over to Ruth for our second case study.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. This particular case study is Mark, and they worked in an organisation where he developed an anxiety and depressive condition over a period of time, and first managed it through the classic sort of taking sick leave, and then it became a compensable injury. And on the initial assessment, apart from sort of all those classic signs, and could clearly understand how that these things had arisen, there were some other features really that are akin to burnout, with the fact that they'd been in this particular part of the organisation for some years. They hadn't really, and it was an organisation where mobility was considered the norm rather than the exception, and it was a really atypical sort of thing to have been in that role for such a long period of time. And the decisions for remaining in that were related to flexibility for childcare and family life and work-life balance and all those sorts of things. And they were the drivers originally that held that person staying working in that job. But anyway, as a part of the assessment with that person, and also the identifying that perhaps burnout was a feature of this, they also volunteered that their psychologist had, independently of my own comments as well, had also identified the same thing. So that was an affirmative sort of feature to the worker. So what we did with that, because of the stressors that were related with the natural job that the person would have been going back to, we did have some flexibility to, I could see it would be a barrier to get them back in a timely manner. And so there were some discussions that occurred with this workplace who are very supportive of alternatives, and they've got capacity to do that. And we looked at a different area of work altogether as the recovery at work process, so that the person, we broke it a 3-month, and we made it really clear that it was going to be a longer term, i.e. 3-month return to work in that area. So we got that person into a completely different area, so that kind of flew in the face of, going what I said previously about low-hanging fruit and doing very familiar work that doesn't require much. The particular nature of this work in and of itself was really refreshing for the person, and there was a very interesting cohesive team that they were part of. So we worked together with I did a task analysis of that new alternative work area, then we met with the prospective host supervisor, had some conversations, walked through the environment, went through the tasks, etc., with them, and we actually developed the return to work, so they returned to their full hours, but in that area, with the view to, after that 3 months, that they would transition back to their other job and would move towards that. And anyway, so that did unfold in that way, and that person really benefited from the change and the refreshment, and also from the opportunity that sort of out of something negative like becoming work injured, they actually got another perspective on the business, and it was sort of like an unexpected positive that came out of it. And it caused them to reflect further about the original conversation that we'd had regarding burnout, and of their own strength, they actually applied for and won a new position for themselves in similar to work what they'd been rehabilitating in. So they actually didn't return back to their original pre-injury duties. They segued within the organisation, but applied for that job on merit. It wasn't through the rehab process. So the rehab process gave them some skills and insight, but it had a finishing point after 3 months. And just prior to that 3-month period, the person, it took them 6 weeks to get up to their normal pre-injury hours, and because they were part-time as well. And then they had 6 weeks of consolidation, and just prior, we were able to return to the doctor and be fully cleared so that they could move into their new job as a fully well and fully cleared person to engage in this new work. And it was a good outcome for them, and they could see that you know, they actually to become well, you know, we were obviously monitoring all the things like their concentration, their focus, their ability to learn new things, to manage their mood and manage their emotions in the workplace, and all of those things progressively improved as time went on. So we had regular reviews, obviously, with the host employer, with the doctor, with the treaters, and that was a good outcome. Thank you, Anne-Marie.
Great, thank you, Ruth. So I'll just continue on through to the end, just with a couple of quick summary points. From the case studies we have discussed, our aim has been to outline the important components of a successful return to work for psychological injuries, specifically that ensuring psychological hazards are addressed appropriately within the workplace, that there is a focus on early intervention, that an effective workplace rehabilitation program and return to work plan is both developed and supported, that there is effective claims management, and most importantly, cooperation, collaboration, and consultation with and between all parties. While workers' compensation requirements differ between jurisdictions, generally employers have a duty to consult with the worker and other involved parties, to develop or be involved in the development of a return to work plan, to provide suitable duties, and to comply with work health and safety laws to ensure the health and safety of workers as far and as reasonable as possible. So the key points that we've covered in today's webinar are including using accredited workplace rehabilitation providers who have the foundations and the skills and knowledge to use the biopsychosocial model of injury management to achieve the best possible outcome for all involved. A mentally healthy workplace is one that protects and promotes mental health by empowering people to seek help for depression, anxiety, or feelings of stress or overwhelm for everyone's benefit. So we certainly hope from our webinar today that we've been able to cover some of the challenges faced with dealing with or managing psychological injuries, some of the potential strategies that may be incorporated into managing and supporting an injured worker with a psychological injury back into the workplace. And hopefully this has been illustrated with some of our case studies. This presentation will be available on the WorkSafe website, and there's just a list of resources and links to websites that those of you who are interested may choose to have a bit of a look at in your own time. So thanks very much, and I'll hand back to Stephanie.
Thank you, Anne-Marie and Ruth, for your presentation. We'll now take questions from the audience, so please use your questions pane to type and submit your questions. And just a reminder, as it was mentioned, today's webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the WorkSafe Tasmania website and then also on the WorkSafe Tasmania YouTube page. So do look out for today's recorded webinar as well as other recorded webinars that are running during WorkSafe month, which will be made available at the conclusion of the month on the 30th of October. Just to remind everyone as well, it is Mental Health Week this week, so please do have a look at what webinars we are running in relation to mental health, which we have been running this week and then also throughout WorkSafe month too. So do head to the WorkSafe Tas month website to have a look at those webinars. So a question, Anne-Marie and Ruth. If someone has or is experiencing psychological injury in the workplace, what is their first step to address it?
Would you like to answer that, Ruth?
Yeah, okay. Their first step to address it, it would depend very much on their circumstances in terms of if they have a good leader that they're working with. Perhaps they may say, look, I'm having some difficulties, and these are the difficulties. It depends also whether they need to go to the doctor first. I mean, I can't give you a actually straight answer, but if it's in the workplace and it seems to be a work-related matter, then they should in the first instance, if they can, talk with their leader about that, and or go and see their doctor if they're not getting that support.
All right, thanks. And there's still time to submit your questions via the questions pane. Also, a reminder that there will be a survey to complete at the close of this webinar, so we do appreciate your feedback. It certainly does help us to frame WorkSafe month for the following year, and we can certainly as well look to frame a program that suit your needs as well. A question, Anne-Marie and Ruth. How do they get to the point of having someone like an OT make an assessment?
So I'm happy to answer this one. So usually once an individual has been to their doctor and been issued with a workers' compensation medical certificate, they would then take that back to the workplace, or if they were certified unfit for work, send it through to their employer, who would then send them a claim form, which starts the whole process. So once the claim form and all the documents have been received by the workers' compensation insurer, the case manager within the insurance company will then look at referring to and appointing a workplace rehabilitation provider. So that's where the initial assessment process that Ruth outlined commences, and that would include the assessment within the workplace. Subsequent to that, then the return to work program would be developed with the identification, for example, of suitable duties within the recommended medical restrictions.
Thank you. Another question, the examples referred to in your presentation were for large organisations. Can you give an example of strategies for a small business?
Oh, that is a difficult one to answer unless I know the specifics about the business, but reflecting on some small businesses that may have been, WRPs have worked with over many years. One of the strategies, because small businesses aren't often as nimble and as flexible or have many options as a large business, one of the ways that we sometimes get around things to help support a worker and the workplace to engage constructively in rehab is to, if they can't identify some suitable duties because there's very limited options, sometimes we can identify some project work that people can do, and sometimes negotiate with the insurer that they may cover that as part of their rehab cost rather than it be an out cost of the employment place. And so that can be one of the strategies. The other strategy in a small, there's many and varied, it's just so dependent on what the needs of the individuals are. Sometimes the other way around is to look at being hosting duties if there's suitable ones can't be found in another host organisation. That's another option as well. And under the Act, the employer's responsible to provide suitable duties, but sometimes they just cannot be found. It's just not possible, and I do appreciate that. And so that's where sometimes we have to look more laterally. But where you can, it is really important to do that. And one of the things I often will say to a small business is there some things you've always thought, gee, if we had more labour or more people, we would love to be able to research this or get this particular product developed or whatever the case may be. And if that person's got that skill set and capacity, then that might be something that you might be able to propose with them. That's not a finite answer.
All right, thank you. There's still some time to submit any questions for today's presenters, so please do put those questions into the questions pane. Anne-Marie and Ruth, are there any final sort of key points that you would like to let the audience know?
I guess
The
from
main
my
one that,
perspective, oh, you go, Ruth.
no, you go.
Sorry. I think from my perspective is the importance of having if it is determined that rehab is involved and needs to be involved, that you do have somebody who has that really good, strong foundation and understanding of the biopsychosocial model of injury management, so they can support the injured worker, the employer, and work in that collaborative role to support everybody through the process. Also noting that everybody is different, as we have identified. Even people with the same situation, the same workplace, the same injury, the outcome has potential to go in all sorts of different directions. Ruth?
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree with what you're saying in synopsis, Anne-Marie, and I will just add to that about really good quality communication that's regular, that's worthwhile, and that's with bringing everybody together in the tent and working in a very collaborative way to support the injured worker. So that's the other feature that must happen, good, strong communication.
Okay. On that note, thank you, Anne-Marie, and move the slide. Sorry. Thank you to Anne-Marie Dean and Ruth Feeger, workplace rehabilitation providers and members of the Tasmanian Association of Vocational Rehabilitation Providers. And thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar, Psychological Injury Towards Safe and Durable Return to Work. As I mentioned, when you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation. We do appreciate your feedback. Today's webinar has also been recorded and will be made available at the end of WorkSafe month. On behalf of WorkSafe Tasmania and the WorkCover Tasmania board, thank you for joining us, and thank you, Anne-Marie, and thank you, Ruth.